Hello everyone. I had a bit of a pause in creating videos because I have been sick and I had to recover. You can notice that my face is still a bit pale. Yeah, I haven't fully recovered, but yeah, let's keep on going. I'd like to continue my series on political economics and more importantly, the details of economic science. And in this episode, I like to discuss the GDP figures, the gross domestic product calculations. And I will show you that it seems this concept has become a tool for global free market capitalism to dominate the language of public discourses. The GDP as a concept appeared in the 19th century, and the first statistical estimates were published since after the Napoleonic Wars, because this was the period when governments realized that the macroeconomic figures are the key indicators of the power of a nation. And since then, GDP became accepted in public discourses. Now, there are attempts to create better tools to estimate the welfare of a society. For example, the Human Development Index includes general health conditions of a country, but actually these figures couldn't become so widely used as the GDP itself. However, I will show you this time that the GDP calculations are fraudulent. Now, what do I mean by this? The inspiration to compose this video came from analyzing New Zealand's recent GDP figures. And last year, the size of the New Zealand economy was 425 billion New Zealand dollars, which is roughly 260 billion US dollars. Now, inside of this 425 billion, real estate businesses and real estate dealings make up about 14%. Now, these numbers are calculated using two main sources. One of them is the actual rental properties, how much they yield in a year. The other one is the concept in question, the owner-occupied dwellings. And actual rentals make up about 6.2% of the GDP. The other element, the owner-occupied dwellings, make up 7.8%. Now, what is this owner-occupied dwelling? It is a completely fictitious number because it is calculated as if owners of a home would rent their own home from themselves. Nobody pays anybody anything. Nothing. No money moves. But there is a figure calculated just to show that there is production in the economy. Now, because this figure is 7.8%, it is the second largest industry in New Zealand. I knew about this concept since the early 2000s when I started working as an economist. And it was then when I realized that expert macroeconomic analysts at investment banks prefer using the expenditure side of the GDP calculations rather than the production side of it, because the production side of the GDP calculations include this fictitious element. Now, this time I wanted to figure out why this fictitious element is included in GDP calculations, and I turned to with this methodological question, I turned to Statistics New Zealand, and they informed me about the fact that if this imputed, this is the actual jargon for this fictitious element, if this imputed component of production would not be included, that would structurally decrease the GDP over time, because historically home ownership was increasing and at the same time rental was decreasing. So from actual monetary transactions, financial payments, there was a big chunk getting out of. Now, if we think that owning a home qualitatively differs from just renting, and it means it improves our quality of life, how would that look on GDP calculations if something that improves the quality of life would at the same time decrease the GDP? You see the fraud in this. Now, the fraud is more apparent when we switch in feminist arguments, and these arguments say that the GDP figures don't include home and domestic works, when we cook for ourselves, when we clean our home, when we wash the dishes, when we wash the laundry. And there are other elements too, like in New Zealand, the do-it-yourself initiatives are quite often happening. Friends are coming together and they just build a deck, and these self-initiatives do not show up in the GDP either. But why is it only that homeownership appears in the GDP? Now, we need to turn to the historical trends. Historically, these domestic works, even caring for the elderly, are decreasing, and they are actually getting substituted by market-based services. For example, we cook less often at home for ourselves, and we order takeaway. Now, when we order takeaway, that appears in the GDP numbers. Meanwhile, the decrease in home cooking does not. So the trend with these domestic works and unaccounted works have never showed up in GDP calculations. Then when they are decreasing, it doesn't cause any problems, because there is an element in the actual financial transactions which shows up, and that is increasing the GDP. Now you see the complete fraud. Well, if we calculate the volume of these works, I made an attempt in the New Zealand context, and I couldn't come up a smaller percentage than 50% of the GDP on the production side. Well, I think we should throw the GDP out of the window and start using something else. Oh, by the way, the black economy does not appear in actual GDP either. However, that's also significant. Even though, for example, recreational drugs are not allowed in many countries, they do exist. There's a market for them. So the GDP will fall on its own sword. This is it for today, and see you in the next one.